What does it mean to be chosen by the sky itself? From the wind-swept steppes of Central Asia, where Mongol shamans read the futures of unborn children in the crackle of fire and the flight of eagles, there comes a story so vast it seems to swallow the horizon whole. A story of a boy born, they say, clutching a clot of blood in his tiny fist, a sign the old ones whispered of a conqueror yet to come. He would rise from nothing, from captivity, from cold, from betrayal so deep it carved the man before any sword ever could. And from that darkness he would forge something the world had never seen and has never seen since. An empire stretching from the Pacific shores to the gates of Europe, bound together by will and thunder, and the ancient belief that heaven itself had given him dominion over the earth. Welcome to the story of Genghis Khan. Now lie back, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world take over. A steppe eagle lifts from the reed grass beside the Onan River. Its primary feathers spread like dark fingers against a sky still pale with the cold before dawn. The river catches what little light there is and throws it back in thin copper ribbons. Frost stiffens the bent stalks at the water's edge, the sharp, mineral smell of frozen mud rising with the first breath of morning wind. Nothing here yields without a cost. Nothing here asks permission to take. Inside the jar, Holun's breath came in slow, deliberate pulls. The birth fire had burned low, its coals breathing orange beneath a skin of gray ash, the air thick with the smell of lanolin, scorched felt, and the iron-sweet tang of blood still cooling on the fleece beneath her. She lifted her son and opened his right fist with her thumb. There, pressed into the soft center of his palm, sat a dark clot, dried black at the edges, deep red at its heart, small as a hawthorn berry but dense, carrying a weight that did not belong in so small a hand. She did not call the shamans. She closed his fingers back around it, pulled the swaddling tight until only his face showed, and spoke his name once into the dim air of the jar. Temüjin, iron. Not far from there, Yesugei crested the low ridge above the river at a canter, his horse's nostrils throwing twin plumes of steam into the cold morning air. The grass beneath the hooves was stiff with frost, each blade crackling faintly under the horse's weight. His captive Tatar warrior had been bound and left with the rear riders, and Yesugei carried that victory in his chest, the way a man carries a hot coal, carefully, aware of its heat. When the red door of his jar came into view below, he slowed. A boy, they had told him, born this morning. He spoke the Tatar's name aloud into the empty steppe. Temüjin. The word left his mouth and the wind took it east. "7 years had passed when Temüjin stood knee-deep in the Onan, the cold water pressing hard against his shins like two hands trying to push him back to shore. He held a sharpened willow stick above the surface and did not move. A gray-brown carp nosed through the shallows below him, its tail fanning slow. He drove the stick down. The wet, percussive thud traveled up through his wrist and into his shoulder. He lifted the fish clear. It was heavier than he expected. That same autumn, Yasuge decided it was time. He took Temüjin east, across the steppe, toward the Ongerat lands, two riders under a sky the color of cold iron. The grass smelled of dry seed heads and horse sweat, and the afternoon light lay flat and amber across the plain. They rode until smoke rose from a cluster of white gurs near a low rise, and Yasuge slowed his horse to a walk. A girl came out between two gurs carrying a wooden pail. She set it down, straightened, and looked at them without stepping back. Her eyes were wide-set and dark, unhurried in their assessment. The eyes of someone who had already decided what she thought and was simply confirming it. Temüjin held his reins and did not look away. Berta did not look away either. Yasuge leaned from his saddle and spoke quietly. She has fire in her eyes and courage in her face. I will ask for her. Temüjin said nothing. He had already agreed. Day Session gave his answer before the fire was lit that evening. Temüjin would stay the season. He would learn the Ongerat ways, and Day Session would learn him. Yasuge lingered at the edge of camp until the western light turned the grass to copper wire. Then he mounted, turned his horse south, and rode. Temüjin watched from between two gurs, one hand resting against the cold felt wall. Yasuge's silhouette shrank slowly into the flat horizon. The brown robe, the short quiver, the set of his shoulders, until the grass closed over him like water. Berta appeared at Temüjin's left shoulder. She said nothing. He did not turn. The copper light faded, and his father was gone, and Temüjin kept watching the place where he had been. Three days later, Yasuge rode into camp bent low over his horse's neck. His face was the color of old ash. Sweat had darkened his brown deal from collar to shoulder, and his hands on the reins shook with the particular fine tremor of a man whose body is fighting something it cannot name. He had met Tatar travelers on the road south, strangers sharing a fire, offering meat and arag, the courtesy of the steppe observed on both sides. He could not have refused. He did not refuse. Holun caught him before he fell from the saddle. His skin burned through the wool. He did not last the night. Holun sent a rider for Temüjin at dusk, and the boy rode through full dark, his pony's hooves striking the dry ground in a hollow, rapid beat. He came through the low red door and found his father already past speech, laid on the sleeping platform with a sheepskin across his chest. Temüjin sat beside him and took his hand. The fingers were very warm still, then less so. He could feel each knuckle, the thick cord of tendon at the wrist. He held on. Yasuge's last breath left without announcement, one exhale that simply did not return. Holun made no sound. She folded her husband's hands herself. Temüjin stayed sitting in the dark after she rose. When he finally came outside, the cold hit his face and the steppe spread away from him in every direction, enormous and indifferent. He stood in it, 9 years old, and already learning what the sky does not give back. Three days later, they were gone. The Taichi Ut broke camp before the frost had left the grass. Temüjin stood at the edge of the tree line and watched the last cart, a flat-bedded thing loaded with rolled felt and iron pots, jolt away westward until the steppe swallowed it whole. Holun stood behind him. She did not call after them. The cold had a mineral sharpness to it, the particular bite of river air in early autumn, and it settled into the back of the throat. The camp was hollow now. Only the fire pits remained, their ash gray and dead, sunken slightly from the weight of nothing. Temüjin picked up a stick from the nearest pit and turned it once in his fingers. Charred, weightless, the black flaking off against his palm. He dropped it. Holun placed her hand flat between his shoulder blades. Not a comfort exactly, more a pressure, a keeping upright. He felt the weight of her palm through the wool. Loyalty, he understood then, was not given with blood. It was chosen. And they had chosen. She found wild onions in the soft mud below the reeds, small bulbs, pale and gritty, trailing hair-thin roots. Crab apples came next, 4 of them, hard as river stones and barely yellow, gathered in the fold of her deal. Temüjin watched her hands as she divided them. The knuckles were cracked at every joint, the skin around the nails split and dark at the edges. She portioned without hesitation, one pile, then another, counting under her breath. She gave the last apple away. Then she straightened, brushed the mud from her palms against her robe, and turned back toward camp, as though she had simply finished a task. Temüjin did not eat his portion immediately. He held the onion and felt its papery skin against his thumb, cool and slightly damp. He looked at his mother's back, her braids steady under the white headdress, her step unhurried. He stored it, not the hunger, not the cold, but the exactness of her hands. The way they did not shake. Conqueror found the cache first. a hollow scooped beneath a flat stone near the bank, packed with dried fish, 4 of them, stiff as bark and smelling of salt and slow rot. He looked up at Temüjin without speaking. Temüjin already knew. He had counted the catch that morning. They found Begda sitting alone in the dry grass 50 paces upstream, chewing. He did not run. He looked at them with flat, unhurried eyes and said nothing, as though the fish were simply a fact of the world he had decided. Temüjin notched the arrow. His fingers were cold against the horn nock, and his jaw was set so hard his back teeth ached. Kassar moved left without being told. Begda did not beg. He only said, "Spare our hearth." The bowstring released with a low, wet snap. The grass flattened in the downstream wind, and the steppe made no sound it had not already been making. Temüjin lowered the bow. The wood was warm where his grip had been. They came at midday, when the shadows pulled straight down beneath the horses' hooves. 4 riders, then 6, cresting the low rise above the camp at a canter. Taichiut, Temüjin recognized the cut of their felt hats before they reached him. He did not run. They came off their horses fast, 2 men taking him by the upper arms, fingers digging into muscle. A leather cord looped his wrists before he could count them all. The cord was still warm from another man's belt. They said nothing about duty. They said nothing about clan. The eldest rider watched Temüjin's face the entire time, as men watch something they are not entirely sure they have caught. The kangway was birch wood, pale and rough-cut, still carrying the resinous bite of fresh sap. It sat across his shoulders like a yoke meant for something larger than a boy. The circular hole at its center, worn smooth by whoever had worn it before him. His neck fit inside it. His wrists did not reach the ground. They walked him between the jers at midday, the felt walls radiating heat absorbed from the open sky. Each family received him, looked at him, and passed him on. Temüjin said nothing. He counted doorways. He counted faces. The woman who could not hold his gaze, the gray-haired elder who held it too long, the boy no older than Kassar who stared at the kangway itself and not at the boy wearing it. The wood pressed his collarbones with every step. He did not hunch. That night, Sorkan Shira came without a lamp. Temüjin heard him first, the soft crush of dry grass under felt boots, the particular quiet of a man moving with purpose rather than stealth. Then the herdsman's hands, wide and calloused as cured hide, found the wooden collar in the dark and eased the tension forward, tilting the board so the rim lifted clear of the raw welts at Temüjin's collarbone. He set a strip of cold mutton on the ground within reach and said nothing for a moment. "Sleep on your side," he murmured finally. "It holds easier." He did not say, "I risk something by doing this." He did not need to. Temüjin ate. The mutton was fatty and dense, and his back teeth ached from the effort. When he swallowed, he was aware of the warmth spreading down through his ribs. Sorkin Shira was already gone. Temüjin lay in the thin dark and turned the name over in his mind the way a man turns a coin. Not spent, not forgotten. Filed. 3 nights later, the festival fires burned high. The drums carried from the Taichiut camp through the birch stands, and the guards set to watch Temüjin had drifted toward the light and the smell of roasting mutton fat. Temüjin felt the man's attention leave before his footsteps did. He stood. The kang weighed what it always weighed. Rough birch, still faintly resinous, the board's edge pressing his jaw upward. He gripped it with both hands, twisted his body, and swung. The wet, percussive crack of wood against skull. The guard dropped into the sedge grass without a sound. Temüjin ran. The forest took him. Dark pine and spruce, the ground soft with rotting needles releasing the smell of damp iron. He ran until the drums were only a low throb in the air, then waded into the Onan. The cold hit him like a fist closing around his chest. He stood neck deep until dawn, the current pressing a slow, insistent weight against his ribs, the kang resting on the water's surface and holding him upright. Stars moved over the gap in the trees above the river. Morning came gray and gradual. Temüjin waded to the bank and lay in the sedge until his breathing slowed. He did not shake. He stared at the brightening sky with eyes that had shed something in the night. Not fear exactly, but the part of fear that hesitates. Sorkin Shira opened the door before Temüjin knocked. He pulled the boy inside without a word, and the heat of the fire pressed against Temüjin's soaked skin like a warm hand laid flat against the chest. The jar smelled of tallow, wet wool, and the mineral sharpness of old ash. Sorkin Shira looked at the kangway once. Then he lifted it from Temüjin's shoulders. It weighed what a sack of wet grain weighs, pale and anonymous, and set it directly into the cook fire. The birch caught slowly, then all at once, the resin hissing as it went. Neither of them spoke while it burned. Before the sky lightened, Sorkin Shira pressed a cloth bundle into Temüjin's hands. Dried curd and strip meat, dense and cold, and led a gray mare to the doorpost. The horse exhaled through her nostrils, a soft rhythmic sound in the dark. "Go to Borta," Sorkin Shira said. That was all. Temüjin mounted and rode south into the last of the night, the mare's hooves muffled in the damp grass, the fire behind him already gone from sight. He rode for 2 days. The Ongurot camp rose from the flat grassland at dusk, lamp glow seeping through jer walls, the smell of mutton fat and trampled hay, and the faint sweetness of dried dung smoke. Borta stepped out to meet him before he dismounted, her braids pinned under a cylindrical gugu headdress, her cream deal bright in the failing light. Inside the wedding jar, Temüjin drew the sable coat from his saddlebag. Dense, dark, faintly warm from being pressed against the horse all day, every hair of it smooth in one direction. Holun had kept it through the lean years without once wearing it. He set it across Berta's shoulders. She pulled the lapels together with both hands and held them there, and neither of them moved for a moment, the lamp oil guttering softly, the felt walls holding the warmth in close around them. Three days later, Temüjin rode into Togrul's camp with the coat rolled across his saddlebag. The Karait chief's jur was twice the width of any Temüjin had slept in. Gray-white felt panels stretched tight over a lattice that creaked faintly in the afternoon wind. Silk pennants snapping above the smoke hole. Togrul sat on a low platform inside, heavy-set and still, his sable-rimmed hat throwing a shadow across the scar on his cheek. Temüjin unrolled the coat and held it out with both hands. Togrul ran his thumb once along the lapel, slowly, the way a man checks the edge of a blade, then looked up. "Your father was my sworn brother," he said. "I will be a father to you." Temüjin set the coat in his arms and walked back into the cold afternoon light. The pennants cracked above him. He had arrived with a gift. He left with an army. The raid came before first light. Temüjin woke to the sound of hooves, not the slow, soft plod of grazing horses, but the hard, rhythmic strike of animals driven fast. He was outside the jair before Berta fully stirred, and in the blue-gray dark he could see them, a line of riders coming out of the north, low over their horses' necks. "Merkit," he called back through the door with one word. Borta appeared in the opening, her braids loose, her feet bare on the cold ground. Their eyes met. He could not take her. There was only one horse close enough, and the riders were already in the camp. She stepped back from the door. He mounted and rode hard toward the tree line, his heels driving once into the horse's flanks, the cold air cutting into his lungs like sheared stone. Behind him he heard the Merkit shouts, the striking of wood, and then nothing he could name. He did not look back. He rode until the camp sounds died and only the wind and the long grass remained. He rode through the morning until Jamuka's horse lines came into view, a long row of piebalds and bays, stamping in the cold, their breath hanging in pale threads above the frost-stiffened grass. Temüjin dismounted before the lead jar and called his blood brother's name once. Jamuka came out pulling his black deal straight at the shoulder, the wide silver ring on his right thumb catching the flat white light. He read Temüjin's face and asked nothing. A single nod, short, final, and he turned back through the door to collect his bow. They spent the rest of that morning moving between cook fires, speaking to men who rose and reached for their quivers without argument. By midday, the ground shook with the gathered horses. They struck before the moon had moved a hand's width across the sky, 3 forces riding in from 3 directions, the thunder of hooves folding into screaming horses and the crack of tent poles collapsing inward. Temüjin rode through the burning. Smoke and scorched felt filled his throat. He called her name into the dark, Berta. The second time an answer came, raw, close, and he wheeled toward it. She was running. He leaned low from the saddle and caught her arm, pulled her up, and she locked both hands behind his neck. He did not loosen his grip for a long time. The riders nearby found reasons to look elsewhere, at the retreating merkets, at the fires, at the wide black steppe, as the two of them breathed against each other in the noise and the heat and the relief that felt nothing like peace. Weeks later, Borta's labor came at night, between one watchfire burning low and the next. The boy arrived loud, fists clenched, and Temüjin held him, a compact, damp weight against his forearm, the skull warm through the thin wool Bert had wrapped him in. "Joki," she said, "the guest." Temüjin looked at the child's face for a long time. Then he pressed his thumb once, gently, against the small knuckles, and handed him back. "No," one spoke the other question aloud. It lived in the pause before a man finished a sentence, in the eyes that cut away at feasts. Temüjin never answered it. He named the boy his son, and the naming was the answer. Not a closing of doubt, but a choice laid down in its place, harder and heavier than certainty. And so it was that Temüjin rode beside Jamuka through a year and a half of open steppe, their combined camp stretching behind them in a long smear of dust and felt and livestock smell. Lanolin, dung smoke, the iron salt tang of butchered meat carried on the west wind. They shared one blanket. They shared one pillow. But Temüjin watched. He watched how Jamuka divided the day's grazing, which families he placed at the front of the column and which he left trailing in the dust. He watched who laughed too quickly at Jamuka's words. He could not name what he saw, not yet. The difference lived just below the surface, the way a fault line lives below good grass. On the morning it ended, Jamuka stood at the edge of camp watching the horses being saddled, and said, without turning, that the horse herders ought to camp separately from the sheep herders. A practical matter. A thing about grazing. Borter heard it. She said nothing, but her hands stilled on the felt panel she was folding. Temüjin heard it too. He finished cinching his saddle, smoothed the leather with one flat palm, and walked to where Berta stood. He took the folded panel from her arms, stiff gray wool, cold from the night, heavier than it looked, and set it on the cart himself. Then he told his people to break camp, to move north. Jamuka did not stop him. Two equals cannot share a sky, and both men knew it, and neither one said so aloud. They came to him on the open ground above the Onan, the clan leaders walking in from every direction across the flattened midsummer grass. Someone had cut 9 strips of white felt and laid them end to end. Temüjin stepped onto them and stood still while the men around him lifted the edges and raised him, the felt bowing slightly under his heels, the summer sun pressing hard on the back of his neck. When they set him down and named him Khan, he did not bow his head or spread his hands in the gestures of a man receiving something unexpected. He straightened. He looked north, then south, then settled his gaze on the sold planted at the field's edge, its 9 white tails hanging without wind. Jamuka moved first. 13 clans rode under his banner. The Taichiut, the Tatars, the Naimans, and others whose names Temüjin would not forget, and they caught his army in the valley of Dalan Baljut and broke it against the river bend. The retreat cost men Temüjin could not replace. By nightfall he had pulled the survivors into a shallow valley, cook fires lit low, the smell of blood and crushed ryegrass sharp in the cold air. He did not sit. He walked from fire to fire, crouching beside each wounded man, asking what he had seen from his position, which flank had buckled first, where the horses had faltered. His boots were wet through from crossing the stream. He kept walking. The answer to Dalan Baljut would not come from grief. It would come from this: a man cold to the knee, listening in the dark. Not far from that cold valley, Jamuka was celebrating. He had won. So he did what victors sometimes do. He made certain everyone understood the cost of opposing him. 70 captives, chieftains, and commanders taken at Dalan Baljut were bound and hauled before the iron cauldrons. The fires beneath them had been burning since midday. The water inside rolled and spat fat droplets onto the trampled earth. He watched. The screaming carried across the camp and past it, into the dusk, where clan leaders sat outside their jurs and heard everything. By morning, 3 clans had struck their tents. Within a fortnight, a dozen more turned their horses east, toward the man who had lost the battle, who asked wounded men what they had seen, and who had never once boiled a prisoner alive. Years of patience ended in the Tatar grasslands in a single afternoon. Temüjin and Togrul swept through the Federation's camps from the west, the thunder of 10,000 hooves pressing the dry autumn grass flat. The Tatars broke and ran and were caught. By the time the cook fires had burned to ash, it was done. Then Temüjin gave the order. Every Tatar male standing taller than a wagon wheel was to be killed. His commanders heard it and went still, not in protest, but in the particular silence of men absorbing something irreversible. He did not repeat himself. The Tatars had poisoned Yesuge on a road. They had done it with a cup of hospitality, in the old custom, in broad daylight. Temüjin had been 9 years old. Now he was erasing the debt the only way the steppe understood, completely and without remainder. Togrul's son had whispered long enough. His advisors had whispered longer. The ambush came at dusk, on open ground where Temüjin's column had no cover. Horses screamed. Men he had known for a decade were cut down in the amber light. He rode hard with 19 followers, riding until the hoofbeats behind them thinned and then stopped. They found Baljuna by smell before sight. Gray-brown water, flat and still as cooled iron, edged with mud that swallowed a boot to the ankle. Temüjin dismounted and walked to the waterline. He crouched and scooped the murky water with both hands and drank it. It tasted of silt and cold rot. He drank it anyway. His 19 men watched him. He looked up at them. He had called Togrul father. That was done. He did not speak of it. He pressed his palms flat against the cold mud and stood. Then one of his men knelt beside him. Then another. Within a breath, all 19 were at the waterline, cupping the silty water in their palms. A Mongol herdsman, a Turkish horse trader, a Muslim merchant whose name Temüjin had learned only days before, a Nestorian soldier who prayed in a language none of them shared. They drank. Temüjin looked at each face in turn. He did not speak of Togrul. He did not speak of armies or gold or the vast grasslands that might still be taken. He said only, "I will remember this day. I will remember every man who is here." The water tasted of rot and cold silt. Every one of them knew it. Every one of them swallowed it anyway. Nothing was signed. Nothing was sworn on fire or felt, or the name of the sky. Just 19 men and one, kneeling in gray mud, and a promise so plain it could not be broken by anything so small as circumstance. He did not stay at the lake long. Within a week, Temüjin's riders hit the Karait flanks before the morning frost had melted from the felt walls of their jurs. The assault came from 3 directions at once. No warning, no herald, no offered terms. Togrul fled west on a lathered gray horse, one son dead behind him, his great camp already burning. He never reached Naiman's shelter. The border guards who stopped him on a dusty scrubland track did not know his face. He gave his name. They did not believe it. An old man alone, without banner or escort, claiming to be the lord of the Karait. It was the kind of lie a desperate man tells. They killed him there, on the dry ground, under an open sky. The news reached Temüjin 3 days later. He sat with it for a long time, alone in his tent, the brazier coals ticking as they cooled. He did not order a celebration. He did not speak of it to his commanders. He simply sat, one hand resting open on his knee, and looked at the far wall of dark red felt until the light outside had gone entirely. They came the following evening, 5 of Jamuka's own men riding in from the west with their anda bound across a saddle. Temüjin had them executed before the horses had stopped moving. No hearing, no reward. Men who sell their sworn lord are not men whose hands he wanted near him. Then he had Jamuka brought inside. The brazier had burned down to a red pulse. Jamuka stood across the coals from him, wrists bound in leather, his black deal torn at one shoulder. He did not look broken. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the road. Temüjin offered to free him, offered a place beside him. Jamuka shook his head once. 2 equals cannot share a sky, he said. You told me that once, or I told you. I no longer remember. Temüjin ordered the death clean. No blood spilled, the old way, the bones unbroken. He watched it done. Then he sat again in the same chair, before the same coals, and the tent held the same shape it always had, only quieter now by exactly one voice he had known since boyhood. Outside, the stars were the same stars they always had been, the same cold scatter across the same black vault. And Temüjin stood beneath them for a long time after. He had known Jamuka's voice for 30 years. The particular weight of it, the way it arrived a half-beat early in an argument, as though the answer had been waiting before the question finished. Now the steppe held only wind through the dried sedge grass and the low percussion of a dying cook fire 20 paces east. He did not mourn, or he did, and beneath the mourning sat something steady and cold as river stone, relief, or its quiet cousin. He held both without choosing between them. Temüjin pressed one thumb hard into the opposite palm until the knuckle whitened. Then he turned and walked back into the tent. Morning gave way to midday, and midday became something else entirely. They came from every direction the steppe offered. Karait, Naiman, Mongol, Merkit remnants, clan after clan, until the Onon's bank held more felt than open ground. The smell was horse sweat and trampled sage, and the sour tang of fermented mare's milk carried in hide bags by the dozen. The shamans moved first, flicking mare's milk to the four winds with bundled horsehair switches, their chanting low and percussive, syllables landing like hoofbeats on packed earth. Temüjin knelt on a square of white felt laid over the grass of his birth river. 9 clan leaders gripped the felt's edges and lifted. The sky above the Onon was the color of hammered bronze. They set him down, and the name left every throat at once. Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan, and the sound crossed the water and kept going. He pressed both palms flat against his thighs. The river ran on, indifferent and cold, carrying nothing with it. That same morning, Shigi Kutuk sat cross-legged on a low felt mat inside the great tent. A length of white silk stretched across his knees, a small clay inkstone balanced on the ground beside him. The silk was the color of fresh cream, cool and faintly stiff to the touch. He dipped the horsehair brush and waited. Genghis Khan spoke slowly. He named the crimes that carried death. He named the debts that carried honor. He named the duties of generals, the rights of the poor, the protection owed to those who served. Each sentence landed in the tent's warm air, and Shigi Kutuku's brush pulled it down into the silk in long, deliberate strokes, the wet ink catching the lamplight briefly before it dulled. Then the Khan paused and said, "This law is above me also." Shigi Kutuka's brush did not stop. He wrote it down the same as everything else, the same pressure, the same ink, the same silk. And that sameness was the point. That same law went out with the army the following morning. Genghis Khan stood at the crest of the low ridge above the parade ground, the cold dawn air sharp with frost-bitten grass and the faint ammoniac sting of 10,000 horses, and watched his Tumans pass below him. They came in silence. Tens flowed into hundreds, hundreds into thousands, thousands into 10,000s, each formation folding into the next without a shouted command, without a stumble. The ground held a low, continuous tremor, not thunder, but something steadier. On the hillside to the east, a Chinese envoy pressed his brush against silk and could not find the word for what he was watching. He wrote, "Not an army, one creature, breathing." Three days later, the Great Wall appeared on the horizon as a long brown seam stitched across pale scrubland, rammed earth and mortared stone, running east and west until it dissolved into the dusty distance on both sides. Genghis Khan did not slow. His scouts had found what the engineers had known for a century and never fixed. The sections did not meet. Between two bastions, the wall simply stopped, and a gap of 40 feet of cold morning air and bare dirt separated one end of the world's greatest boundary from the other. He rode through it at a canter, his horse's hooves striking the hard ground in a flat, clean rhythm. The unfinished stonework passing on either side close enough to touch. He did not look at it. Behind him, the Temüjins poured through in columns, the way the Onan breaks through spring ice. Not by force, but by finding the place where the barrier was already finished. The city burned for 3 days before the smoke thickened enough to taste. Genghis Khan sat on a gray roan mare at the crest of a low hill, the reins loose across his thigh, and watched the black column rising from where Zhongdu had been. The smell reached him before any report did, not wood smoke, but something heavier and slicker coating the back of the throat like tallow held over a flame. A general climbed the hill on foot and stopped at the horse's shoulder. He said that the streets ran with the fat of the dead. He said the tiles were still too hot to walk on. He waited. The Khan did not speak. Below, the smoke folded upward in slow, dense rolls against an orange sky, and the city that had taken centuries to build continued its long, unhurried unmaking. The roan mare shifted her weight and stamped once, and the Khan's hand moved to her neck, a small, flat press of the palm, and she stilled. He watched until the stars appeared behind the smoke, pale and distant, and said nothing at all. Three weeks later, the smoke was gone and the Khan's camp had moved west. He stood at the edge of the bazaar in the early morning, the air carrying dried apricot and cardamom and the sharper bite of fresh-tanned leather, and watched the merchants load the last of the camels. 500 men, 100 camels, bales of silver and silk and ivory combs wrapped in undyed felt. One merchant, a small Khwarezmian with ink-stained fingers, paused at the Khan's stillness and bowed. The Khan did not look at him. He watched the lead camel rise, its joints unlocking one by one, the silver in its packs shifting with a low, dulled clink. Trade first, then knowledge, then, if necessary, something else. The caravan moved west into the pale morning light, and he watched it until the last camel's outline thinned to nothing against the empty horizon. The news came 3 days later. First, the caravan, then the ambassador. The Shah had taken both, the silver, the silk, the 500 men, and returned the ambassador in a sack. What remained of him? The Khan's general who delivered the report did not look up from the ground when he finished speaking. The Khan said nothing. He walked out of camp alone, up the long slope of a brown hillside, until the cook fires were small orange points below him, and stopped. The midday sun pressed flat and hard against the back of his neck. Dry grass crackled under his boots. The sky above him was the deep, cloudless blue it always was. That same blue he had looked up at from the mud of Baljina, from the Kang, from his father's burial ground. He removed his hat, held it at his side. Then he knelt on the hillside and pressed his forehead to the warm earth, and asked the eternal sky for only one thing. Not victory, not rage, strength enough to begin. He rose from the hillside and walked back into camp without stopping at the fire. 3 months later, Samarkand heard the Mongols before it saw them. A low vibration moving through the packed earth of the trade road, felt in the soles of sandals and the feet of market stalls. Then the outriders appeared on the plain, and then the Tumen spreading across the horizon in a dark line that did not stop spreading. The city had walls of fired brick, blue glazed at the gate arches, 3 centuries old. It had a garrison of 100,000. The merchants sealed their storehouses. The imams climbed the minarets. Everyone waited for the siege towers that never came. Instead, the Mongols split and split again, and rode for every gate at once. The northern gate went first, then the eastern, then 2 gates the garrison commanders had not thought to wait heavily, because no army had ever come from those directions. By the time the Khwarezmian officers understood what was happening, the courtyard horses were screaming, and the blue-tiled archway was full of riders moving at a walk, unhurried, the way a river occupies a channel it has found for itself. By evening, the governor knelt in the dust of his own market square, both palms flat on the paving stones, his gold-stitched robe pooling around him. The walls stood unmarked. Not one stone had been struck. The governor's gold-stitched robe was still settling into the dust of Samarkand's market square when a rider was already 3 weeks west of it, carrying a letter into China. Chu-Chu-Ji read the summons in his monastery on Mount Shandong. Thin paper, dense brushstrokes, a seal pressed deep into red ink, and set out west on foot and horseback across 2 mountain ranges and a desert, a journey of 10,000 li, taking nearly 2 years. He arrived at the Khan's campaign tent in the Hindu Kush, carrying a plain, gnarled wooden staff worn smooth at the grip, his white beard flattened against his robe from the mountain wind. Temüjin listened to the old monk's footsteps approach across the felt matting, then looked at him, this frail man who had walked further than most armies march, and asked his question plainly, "How does a man live forever?" Chu-Chu-Ji set his staff carefully against his knee. He said there was no elixir, only restraint. Moderation in eating, in drinking, in desire. The body preserved by tending to what it already had. The Khan did not move for a long moment. Outside, a cold mountain wind pressed against the dark red felt walls. He called for a scribe. The scribe's notes from the Hindu Kush were still being copied when the Shisha campaign began. The Tanguts had promised soldiers and sent nothing. The Khan rode out anyway, east across the Gobi's gray grit and frozen salt flats, into the high cold of the Ordos. Somewhere in that country, his horse shied at a pheasant flushed from the brittle scrub, a small, stupid thing. And Temüjin hit the ground hard enough that his back teeth clicked together. That night, the fever took him. He lay on the wolf-fur-thrown platform in the campaign tent, the iron brazier glowing a hand's width from his ribs, sweat darkening the collar of his silk deal. His breath came shallow and fast, the way a man breathes who is fighting something he cannot see. His generals came to him and said, "Rest. Go home. The Tanguts will wait." He told them to continue the siege. Each morning a report was brought and read aloud to him. Each morning he gave his orders from his back, his voice unchanged, his gray-green eyes fixed on the smoke hole above, that circle of black sky rimmed in felt, narrowed to a point. One night the reports stopped. He called them in before dawn, his sons, his generals, and they knelt on the felt in the lamplight, their faces unreadable. His voice was low, each word deliberate, the way a man speaks when he is rationing what remains. "Do not let the enemy know, not until the last city falls. Let them think I am still watching. Then no tomb, no mound, no marker of any kind. Ride horses over the ground until the grass grows back, and let the earth take me the way it takes everything else, without being asked. Nobody moved. He held their gaze a moment longer, long enough that each man felt it land. Then he turned toward the felt wall, his shoulders settling into the wolf fur. His breath slowed. The lamp guttered once and steadied. Outside, the steppe was dark and cold and utterly indifferent, the way it had always been from the first morning to this one. The sky he had ridden under his whole life waited above the smoke hole. He let it go. The riders moved west across the steppe, with no sound but the soft percussion of hooves in dry grass and the occasional creak of saddle leather tightening in the afternoon heat. Above them, the sky opened, not in grief, not in ceremony. The sky simply was a deep, saturated blue, the particular blue of late summer above the Mongolian plateau, where the air holds no moisture and no memory. A single white cumulus drifted northwest, its shadow sliding across the grass below, crossing the column of riders, passing on. They rode on. The Onan glinted somewhere to the east, cold and indifferent as it had always been. The grass bent in one long, slow wave from north to south, as it had bent on the morning he was born, clutching blood in both fists, as it had bent on every morning since. The sky received nothing. It held nothing. It remained wide and permanent and blue, over the horses, over the long grass, over the world one man's fury and grief and impossible will had reshaped from one end to the other. The grass closed behind them. The sky stayed.